Yes.
We made it. So I'm going to show a few more pictures of the LeDuc Mansion to start with. This is from, I believe, the backyard. Am I right, Mariah?
No, that would be from like the south front yard.
Side.
Yeah, so it's like a side profile. That would be from the opposite corner on the northern front side. That is the south porch. So it's actually just that way to me, and that's the front, which is just that way to me right now.
Very good, very good. Well, you can see it's a beautiful house, and we were talking, before we got interrupted about when the house was built, and kind of what kind of if it's considered, a mansion or a rich person's house. So I'm going to let you talk about when the house was built, Mariah, and if you can talk about the status of the family and who lived there and how they got there, that would be just wonderful.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to say
So
one thing. She's inside the house right now.
I
So
am. Yes, I'm in the dining room right now. I'm sitting at the dining room table. China right next to me. This is not the family china, but I moved it out of the way for this. So the LeDuc house was built by William and Mary LeDuc, and it was started in 1862 and completed in 1865. You can't exactly see the room that I'm in now on this photo, except that if you look at that side porch, it's the second window back. That's the room I'm sitting in, just in case anybody is watching and wants a little perspective. So the LeDuc family were sort of this working class family in a lot of ways. Many people see this house and they think that they had a lot of money, but it really put them into genteel poverty. The design for the house was estimated to cost about $4,600, and that was without plumbing or electricity. But with plumbing and electricity, it should have cost about $6,000. They were really surprised to find that it was going to be $6,000, but it was being built right during the Civil War. So of course the cost of everything was increasing, but total expenses paid ended up being $30,000. So that would be like thinking you were building a $25,000 house, and instead your house costs actually closer to $550,000. So it was an exponential cost that they weren't necessarily anticipating. And so they pretty much were house poor. They had the house, they had themselves, they had the things they could put in it, but they didn't really have a lot of means other than that. William was a lawyer by trade, but he didn't often practice law. It was actually law that originally brought him to Minnesota in 1850. He came here to open his first law firm, came to the city of St. Paul, and he opened the first stationery and bookstore in St. Paul and ran his law practice out of that. He goes back to Ohio in 1851 to marry Mary, and then brings her back to St. Paul to start their life. And they come down to Hastings. Yeah, there they are. So William and Mary LeDuc. Mary Bronson was her maiden name. And they met when he was at school in Kenyon College. He was going for his law degree. She was there with her father on a speaking engagement. They decided they liked each other. A good old-fashioned courtship started, and then they became engaged.
And then what happened when the Civil War came? I have a little slide to get us in the mood for the Civil War if I can find it. What happened when the Civil War came?
So when the war came, William decided that he wanted to enlist. He, by most accounts, was actually a little too old to enlist, really. And so he got some letters of recommendation that were sent, and then they allowed him to join the quartermaster's department. He was an officer in the quartermaster's department and did a lot of really instrumental things as far as helping the Union Army in their war efforts. And while he was serving in the war, Mary was with their 3 children in Ohio, the 3 that they had at the time. And then the house was being constructed during that time.
Sorry, trying to find the kids.
Oh, perfect. Yep. So there they are. So the 3 children that are together there are Minnie is the oldest. She's the taller girl. The girl Florence, and then the boy is Willie. And then Alice is the baby that's pictured individually there. And she was born in 1868, the only one of the 4 children to be born in the house. The older 2 girls were actually born in Ohio. Mary had gone back to Ohio and given birth there. And then Willie was born in Minnesota.
Okay.
But those three were the only ones that were around when the house was being constructed.
They're cute. We can't see the youngest because of the way I'm sharing my screen. We'll maybe show her again later.
Oh, we see her.
We see her on
Okay.
our end,
Can
so
you?
We see her on our
Oh,
side,
yeah.
yeah.
wonderful,
Hopefully.
wonderful. And so he must have done pretty well in the war, because didn't they offer him a brigadier general title? I'll kind of go back a
Yeah,
little bit if I can find him.
yes, so when
Go
he
ahead.
mustered out, about 6 months before the end of the war, before 6 months before he mustered out, they promoted him to Brigadier General of the Volunteer Corps. And it was actually breveted Brigadier General. And that's sort of an important distinction to make, because breveted essentially means that he was general in title only, not in pay. So his pension as he went out would have been his highest rank before that. But it was a title he was really proud of. So he actually maintained the use of the title general for the rest of his life. This image here is actually a picture of our video screen that we have in the library, but it has an image of the painting that William had commissioned of himself at Lookout Mountain, which was one of his bigger moments as a quartermaster in the Civil War.
Awesome. And just before we move off of William, the thing I thought was really impressive about William is, like, he was involved in almost every type of trade. There were into lots of different commodities, and also that he seemed to always be on the cutting edge of history and would hobnob with presidents. And I think one of the first people they had over was the president, wasn't it? Ruther B. Hayes, or I'm going to get that wrong. I'm going to butcher it. But he seemed to always be on the cutting edge of everything and be very ambitious, but kind of always the bridesmaid, never the bride kind of thing.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it. He always seemed to be, in my opinion, just ahead of his time. Like, he had these great ideas and these great concepts for what we could do in our country to make things better, but nobody was quite where he was yet. Or when he was in his business ventures, he was always so loyal and honest and shrewd in his business ventures that he was really easily taken advantage of, because he didn't expect other people to not act the same way that he did in business. So one of his big ventures was, yeah, me too. One of his big ventures was the railroad, and he really wanted to connect the East Coast to the West Coast with a railroad system, and then hopefully bring it through Hastings. That was like his big mission, is that these two railroads, or this railroad, would connect both sides of the United States. Hastings would be the middle point. So he did actually bring the railroad into Hastings, and he had the Hastings and Dakota line. But his business partner in the railroad did some sort of shady backdoor dealings behind William's back, and got into work with some other railroad moguls, eventually kind of iced William out in a way. And that never really took off, but then he got a lot of money. So he became very wealthy in this area. And that was one of the things. William was typically pretty forgiving, but he was one of the men that for the rest of his life, he was kind of like, oh, that Butterfields. He's a little cranky about how that had gone down, but he did rub elbows with a lot of influential people, like Henry Sibley, our first elected governor, second territorial governor. He was friends with Alexander Ramsey. He knew Rutherford B. Hayes and William Tecumseh Sherman. He had gone to school in Ohio with those two, and then served in the Civil War. For Hayes, he was actually his commissioner of agriculture. So he was essentially part of Hayes's cabinet and was doing a lot with the agriculture in the United States. Essentially, William invented the typewriter. And now I'm not saying he was the only person who ever had the idea to make something like the typewriter. But he had this concept for a machine where you would push buttons, a little foot would come up, it would hit a tape, and it would write your letters for you. And he was going to call it the typewriter. And William says, well, we already have machines like that, but I have this great idea. So he explains the typewriter to him. He writes it out on a piece of paper, draws this sort of idea behind it, and says, what about this? Do you think you could make this? And the man says, yeah, I think I could. And he says, great. The idea is yours. All I ask is that you mass produce it. I just wanted to be available to the masses, actually do something with it. And the guy says, all right. So he takes the idea and runs with it. And this was Scholl, one of the two people who was credited with inventing the typewriter. And later down the road, when William is Commissioner of Agriculture for Hayes, there's a salesman who kind of like knocks on the door. He's selling typewriters. William buys one and then is pretty much responsible for introducing the typewriter to all government offices after that. This one thing that was his idea that he was like, it's going to be great. And then never actually did it. And really the only reason why he gave it away is because he felt that it was better served out in the public than stuck in his brain. So he just said, okay, here's my cash cow. You can have it.
Again,
Wow, wow. And so before we move off of him, one of the other things that we found fascinating about him was that he wrote this book. I suppose the print, even if it focuses, it won't focus. He wrote a book on spiritualism called Beyond the Grave, The Spiritualism of William Gates LeDuc. And so he did paranormal investigations back kind of at the end of the age of spiritualism. So we did this paranormal investigation, and the man that owned the property used to hold seances, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Mariah, in the house in order to reach his deceased wife. And he was real. He researched back to the Egyptians and everything else, and summarized it in his book that he published. But again, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. It was at the end of spiritualism, so nobody really cared as much because people were moving off of that era. But what can you tell me about his link to spiritualism, Mariah?
Yeah, so he does get invested in spiritualism rather late. It's around 1904, 1905, and this is following the passing of Mary. He passed away, and William was actually out on the West Coast. He was sort of pursuing a business venture there, and he couldn't get back. So he received word that Mary was not doing well and then that she had passed away, and he couldn't make it home. So he actually even, by most accounts that we can find, missed her funeral. And Mary truly, truly was the love of his life. They had a beautiful relationship. And so he had a lot of remorse over the fact that he was unable to be there for her and then to sort of properly say goodbye. He also definitely missed her very much. And so he really gets invested in this idea that you can communicate with the dead and that life continues afterwards. And so he really gets invested into the spiritualism movement because it's a way of communing. He also, in his book, does all this research and goes far back to sort of show, like, here are all of the different societies over centuries that believe in this afterlife and believe that you continue on, and that there must be some stake to that, because if all of these cultures that are sort of independent from each other have this same idealization, then why isn't it true? So he starts participating in seances, and some of them he does in person. Others he actually does by letter. So he'll write letters to say, hey, in your next investigation, if you happen to come across so-and-so, will you ask them this question for me? And so he communes that way. But then hosted a couple of his own here in the house with his daughters, mostly an effort to try to contact Mary, though we haven't found in any of his writings that she ever came through. Though in his book, he does discuss how he had interactions with Darwin, with Butterfield, the man who cheated him on the railroad, and also with R.B. Hayes.
So to me, the real star of this whole show is George Daniels, who was a slave in the Civil War. And I'm just going to get to a different screen so we can show him. So, of course, we've got William on the left and George Daniels on the right. And I think their relationship and everything about George Daniels, who's on the right, is absolutely fascinating. And, you know, like the screen said, they reached across the social, political, and racial divides, because the fact that their relationship thrived, and the fact that George Daniels was able to do everything he did in his life, really speaks to the two men that we see on the screen. But I would like Mariah to start at the beginning during the Civil War, and how George Daniels, um, what part he played in the Civil War, with the South, and then how he got to the North and how he met William, and maybe just his story. And I have a few pictures to show once we get going along.
Yeah, definitely. So, George is, first of all, he's an incredible man. And what we have been researching about him, both in the past and presently, just keeps pointing towards that. He was born into slavery down near Rome, Georgia, and later, forced and conscripted into the Confederate Army. So he had to fight for the Confederates. It was during one of the battles that he was involved in, and we're not entirely sure which one. And the hard part about that is that, of course, in part because he was a Black man of that time period, his story is not as well documented as others from the time period, predominantly white people, right? So we're not entirely sure which battle it was, but he played dead on the battlefield. And he actually covered himself with his fallen comrades so that nobody could tell that he was still alive. Under cover of darkness, he scurries away to the Union Army lines. At this point, we're not sure if he was mustered in. We haven't found any official Union Army like draft cards, but not a draft card. You know what I'm saying? I lost the word suddenly, but we haven't found that he was officially mustered into the Union Army. But we do know that he was put to work in the quartermaster's department. And this is where he connects with William, as far as we can tell, based on accounts from George and from William in their journals and writings and things like that. And so he is good with horses. He works with the horses. He meets up with William, continues through the war in the Union Army presence, helping with the Union effort. And then following the war, William knows that George is going to need somewhere to go, that he doesn't necessarily have some place that he can go after that. Okay, so basically, he's working with horses. After the war, William knows that he doesn't have anywhere to go. So he says, you know what? I need these horses of mine. He had 9 of them transported back to Minnesota. And if you can do that for me, I'll give you a job when you get there. So George takes the papers that he needs. He's traveling with one other person, and they take these 9 horses from Washington, D.C. all the way back to Minnesota. And once he gets here, he actually beat William, who had to go to Ohio and collect his family. He becomes William's hired hand. And so he works for the family from the end of the Civil War, about 1865, until it's either 1878 or 79. We're not really sure exactly when he left, but around the time when William was serving as Commissioner of Agriculture. So he worked on the land. He lived in the carriage barn for a while. When he gets married
Is this
to, yeah,
Is
that
it?
is.
Okay. All right.
So, yep, there's a picture of his room. It's not, of course, the things that he had, but this is our current exhibit for George Daniels. We're working right now to actually expand and make an even bigger one that'll tell more of his story and the other Black families in Hastings. But you can see sort of a map there. You can't really see the details, but it has sort of like his journey from the Civil War and on.
First of all, I thought this was cool. There were only 14 Black people in Hastings at the time that he met her, and she was one of them. So he meets his wife, and once she becomes pregnant, didn't they bring them into the house until they could fix up another building for them? Or did I imagine that from what you said?
They were working in the house. They were still living in the barn, but it was Mary who said, they can't live in the barn. They're married now. They have a baby. They can't be living in this barn room. And so that's when they built the small house that's no longer standing on the grounds for them to occupy. And then later they moved out of that house into the house near the farms, that they were tenanting on. But, they did work on the grounds. Chloe worked in the kitchen. That was technically George's second wife. She was in Prescott. Cordelia, he met in the Hastings area. He marries her first and then they get a divorce. Then he marries Chloe. And she was in Prescott, but they met in Hastings. And then that's who he was married to for the rest of his life. But she worked in the kitchen. And there was one point in time where she had the new baby and it was in the kitchen and it had fallen asleep next to the stove. And she was just so tired from work. She went back to the barn and the family was awoken to some very desperate pounding on the door. And William went down to see what was going on, and it was Chloe, and she had forgotten the baby in the basket in the kitchen. So she wanted to come back and get him to bring him back into the barn with them before the house was built. So just fun interactions like that where they actually detail their lives with these people together.
Wow. And so
Yeah.
then eventually George moves, what I thought was cool too, he goes back to his birthplace or near there in, was it Georgia?
Mhm.
And they don't treat him well. And he comes with his life savings and they relieve him of it. And so he ends up, feeling all that racism of the South and ends up saying, hey, they treated me a lot better up north. So he brings his family back, but not to Minnesota, to Brookings, South Dakota.
Mhm.
And he became, like, I'm sure he did a lot of things, but he was like a school clerk. And when he died in Brookings, they closed, I think the funeral was in a town called White. They closed down all the businesses for several hours for his funeral. And his obituary was in 4 different newspapers. And the newspaper said wonderful, wonderful things about him. And he was held up high, and in that era, right after the Civil War. I mean, Black people at that time weren't immediately having it great after the war. It was in many ways just as bad or worse. And so he
Yeah.
died, like, kind of, I don't know if the right word is venerated, but it was pretty amazing. I'm just going to show you a few other pictures. This is a little schoolhouse in Brookings, South Dakota. I think it's on your brochure. And it
Yes.
shows it says some of his family members. Now, Mariah, the big guy that has his hand on the little boy, he looks like George Daniels, but that guy's got to be too young, right? That's got to be one of his kids.
Yeah, so actually in this research that we've been doing, at one point in time, we did think that this was George with the students. Now, upon further research, we're fairly certain it was one of his sons that is there, and that the other Black students were either his children or there were a couple other Black families that were living in the area. So we haven't fully identified who everybody is, but that they were connected in some way. So he did move to White, South Dakota initially. He set up his homestead. He was doing pretty well there, went back down south to see if he could find his family, but also because he kind of just, in a way, missed where he grew up, or wanted to see if it would have been improved. And then, like you said, they did relieve him of his life savings. And a lot of that had to do with prison time and bail that he had to pay. And he was getting arrested really just for being Black. And so he kind of talks about that. But then when he comes home, back up north, he does move to Brookings, which is very close to White, South Dakota. And he is a school clerk there. But what's incredible too is he didn't know how to read or write when he got to Minnesota. Chloe, his wife, actually taught him how to do that. So to know that he didn't have those skills, and then actually in like the White County Historical Society, I had the privilege of going there this summer for a commemoration event for George. But in the White County Historical Society, they actually have the copies of the documents that he signed his name on as the school clerk. So to know that he couldn't do that, and then he has his signature documented in the Historical Society, is just so cool to me, because it's one of those stories that wouldn't otherwise be easy to track or to tell. And it's not the case for everybody who was in the same circumstances as him. But yes, we're fairly certain that's one of his sons.
Yeah. And you look at his hand on the little boy.
Yeah,
know,
so
very sweet.
they were really well integrated into the community, and there's a lot of discussion about that in the paper. George actually comes up quite frequently in the the White County paper, the White, pardon me. He's mentioned a lot. So they talk about card games that George is playing in. They talk about if his kids are sick, or Chloe actually got struck by lightning at one point in time, and that made it into the newspaper.
Wow.
So it's pretty well documented in a lot of ways once he gets there.
Hello, beautiful people. Psychic Debbie here with beautiful Diane, the ghost hunting grandmas.
And you know what Debbie and I have resolved to do is to talk about the message or what we've learned from our paranormal investigation about the people who were speaking to us, or about the history. Another way to look at it is, what have we learned from the lives of the people that live there and what we know about them? So, Debbie, I've done some thinking on this, and I bet you have too.
Yeah.
So we're
Yeah.
both going to be surprised with what the others say, and we could have the same message, or we could have a different message. So, who wants to go first? Woo.
I can go first. I can go first. Um, know that one thought and one feeling can change the world. And what I'm thinking of is how LeDuc invented the typewriter. I am just really not shell shocked, but really shocked that he didn't get the affirmation, but it was in his mind. He thought of it in his mind, and he was in fun and joy, and he went after it, and he even gave it away. It kind of reminds me of Tesla, like inventing the electricity and gave it away. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's like, if you have a thought in your mind, or you're trying to invent something or create something, I say go for it. Even in the 1800s or early 1900s, this, intellectual man invented the typewriter. And I think that's just really cool. That, and also that great friendships, no matter where you come from, is the most powerful, gratifying, beautiful thing that can happen. With the great friendships with him and was it George? What was the black man's name? Do you know?
George Daniels.
Yeah. I mean, just beautiful.
Very wonderful. So my message, or my takeaway from the investigation and the history, is don't let the world tell you who you are, and don't let the world tell you what you can do or accomplish. So I would say, don't let the world tell you, if you're a woman, that you can't do something, and don't let the world tell you that you're too old to do
Right.
something. Don't let the world tell you or define who you are. Yeah.
Right.
And so that, and never give up. That's the other part of that. So
Right.
that's what I got from them. And from the paranormal investigation, I want to ask you your opinions about that. We didn't get a lot of full sentences or anything, but
No.
we got welcoming spirits is what we got, like welcome to our home.
Yeah.
And and I thought that was really cool, because they went house poor to have that home. And they gave their life to that home and to have it. And then here we are 150 years later, still being welcomed by them, and people coming
Right.
and touring their place. And so the house lived on.
They're probably acknowledging it. It's like, oh, people are looking at our house. They probably love that we're looking at their house, looking at their furniture, looking at their items, saying, oh, I love this, I love that, I love this. And I think because we came in there, because that's the way we ghost hunt, is through more love, joy, and communication. I think with us, you, me, and even Mariah going, oh, this is a beautiful place.
Well, I suppose we should begin to end this. So, Debbie, do you want to end our bye?
Well, I want to say blessings and smiles to you beautiful people.
So, signing off from Ghost Hunting Grandmas. And remember, everyone needs a grandma, even the dead.
Yep, we all need a grandma.